Nobody's introduced us? Okay. We're on. Hi, everybody. I'm Mary Schmeek. I write for the Chicago Tribune, and I am here to moderate a panel about social institutions and immigration. This is the last panel of this very long day, so I've been referring to it as the happy hour panel. Unfortunately, I forgot the drinks. So what I'd like to do is to start by having each of the panelists give us a brief introduction, tell us who they are, what they do, and we'll move on from there.
Hi, I'm Nilda Flores Gonzalez. I'm a professor in the Department of Sociology and Latin American and Latino Studies. And most of my work revolves around issues of race and identity among Latinos. And since 2006, the immigrant marches, I started doing more work on immigrant communities. And some of the stuff I'm going to talk about today has to do with a project that I carried out with two of my colleagues who are here, Andy Garno and Xochitl Vada, looking at immigrant integration in the suburbs.
Good afternoon, my name is Grace Ho, and I'm president of Woods Fund Chicago, which is a private grant-making foundation that funds nonprofit organizations to do organizing and advocacy around issues of poverty and race. I've been with the foundation for 2.5 years. I worked in state government at the Illinois Department of Human Services previous to that for about 9 years, and I was one of the key liaisons to the Governor's Office of New Americans and the work that happened around immigrant integration. And prior to that, I was the executive director of Chinese Mutual Aid Association in Uptown and I was actually one of the founders of one of the immigrant coalitions in
So my name is Mike Rodriguez. I was raised in a northern Mexican border town where all of the signs on the street were bodegas and lavanderias, where the mother tongue, Spanish is spoken freely throughout the day. That northern border Mexican town is Little Village. It's on the southwest side of Chicago, where I continue to live this day, and where I continue to work this day as the executive director of Enlace Chicago. Enlace's mission is to improve the quality of life of Little Village residents. A community of 80,000, 85% Mexican Americans, the largest concentrations of Mexican Americans in the Midwest, the largest concentration of the undocumented in the state of Illinois. Of our 80,000 residents, 20,000 are undocumented. I'm really happy to be here, and thank you, IC, for having me.
Nick Theodore, I'm a professor of urban planning and policy here at UIC. My research that intersects with this topic, or the topic of this panel, is on workers' rights issues. And I do a lot of research with the National Day Labor Organizing Network, the National Network of Day Labor Organizations, and also the National Domestic Workers Alliance.
Brief. So Nick, start by telling us what social institutions are as they relate to our panel today. What kind of social institutions are we talking about?
Yeah, so anyone that saw the program saw that social institutions lies at the heart of this talk today. And I think we can think about social institutions from a number of different vantage points. One vantage point is to look at the major societal systems, the societal infrastructure of a city, the social welfare system, the criminal justice system, electoral education systems, healthcare, the job market, the housing market. For this conversation, I suppose we'd also add the immigration system into that conversation. I think what's important to remember about these social systems is that they're unevenly developed. They're unevenly developed spatially across the metropolitan area and across this country, and they're unevenly developed socially they tread down in different communities among different populations in very different ways. But these are the social infrastructure of our society. And many of these systems actually have been created to ameliorate hardships and inequality. The irony being that some of these systems entrench those hardships and inequality. They exacerbate them. So we can't look at these social systems as entirely neutral systems that operate for the betterment of everyone, but we've got to understand the way in which these systems impact communities differently.
Nick, can I interrupt for a second? Can you give us an example of a social institution or system that actually hinders life for immigrants or the improvement of life for immigrants?
Well, I mean, arguably, the first example would be the immigration system right now. We've wound up in a quite reverse situation politically and policy-wise. And certainly that is impacting different segments of the immigrant population, different immigrant populations across this country differently, and in different parts of the country it affects people differently. And I think we could probably talk about that a little bit more as this panel progresses. But we can also look at the education system as well, right? We know, I mean, this is a city that has had continual struggles over public education. It's not my area, don't ask me anything about it, but just as a resident, a lifelong resident of the Chicago area, we all, and you know as well, that the way in which the education system operates does not uniformly benefit all communities in all populations. So I think whenever you're looking at these social institutions, these social systems, we need to try to understand in a very detailed kind of way what their impacts are, where they're creating opportunities for some, but also challenges for others. But then if we move down a level from these broad societal systems, down to the neighborhood level, we can talk about social institutions as being community-based organizations or faith-based groups, the various social service agencies that exist, social movement organizations that have risen up, especially around immigration issues, political organizations such as political parties and precinct groups, and a range of clubs and social organizations that are either formal or informal, but have become an integral part of neighborhood life. And many of these social institutions exist for the very reason that some of those societal systems are failing us, are failing certain communities. And so those social institutions step into the gap to try to change the politics and economics and the lived experiences of those systems. And then finally, really quickly, we can also think about a migrant civil society. In my own work, we've adapted this terminology. Sochi Bada here at UIC and her colleagues had advanced ideas around migrant civil society as a distinct segment of civil society that sits between households, the market, and the state. And in their work and the way we've tried to adapt it is to try to understand this is a distinct segment of civil society that is immigrant-focused, often organizations that are immigrant-founded or immigrant-led, and operate at a range of spatial scales. Some of them are very local, some are involved in national politics, and in Sochi's work, her focus is a lot on the transnational activities of these organizations. So I think there's a lot in play here when we talk about societal institutions. And the key thing to remember is that these are organizations and systems that are impacting everyday life in the city of Chicago, but doing so in often very different kinds of ways.
Thank you. Nilda, you and your students have been doing research up in Lake County, right? On various social institutions that work with immigrants. Tell us some of what you found and how that relates to what's going on in Chicago.
Yeah, so one of the things that we've been doing, and this is a collaborative project in which I want to stretch what Nick is saying and bring it down to the context of local communities, So when we talk about institutions, it could be, very macro, but I want to bring it down to the level of communities and what happens. And, Chicago is a traditional gateway, right? There have been immigrants for a long time. Chicago has social institutions that have helped immigrants adapt to city life and to life in the U.S. However, in the past 20, 25 years, increasing migration from Mexico particularly, is bypassing the city of Chicago. Immigrants are not coming anymore necessarily to a traditional gateway that would have those institutions that would help them integrate themselves into life here, but rather are going into the suburbs. So today we have this urbanization of Latinos have ended up with, in the Chicago metropolitan area, 57% of Latinos live outside of Chicago. So I wanted to bring into play here of that, we think immigrant within Chicago, but actually a bulk of the Latinos or the immigrants in this area live outside of Chicago, and that we need to look at this suburban context, particularly because the suburban context lack the infrastructure that places like Chicago have. So they don't have the capacity, and by that I mean they don't have the resources, the space, there's issues of housing when immigrants move into new areas, there's issues with schools, and so on. So many of these suburbs do not have the capacity to be able to integrate Latinos or immigrants into their communities. And the other thing is competency, that then you add to that issues about culture and language that make it very difficult to integrate newcomers. And so, so I wanted to bring that into the discussion that, I hope that we can have a dialogue about what is happening in communities in which there has been an influx of immigrants and what happens with them. How can communities reach out and integrate them, and also what can immigrants in those communities do? So that's one of the points that I want.
So what communities did you actually look at?
So we looked at 6 communities in Lake County, and we started with Waukegan. We tried to do a variety of communities that had different sort of stances toward immigration, also different racial, class, and makeup. So we looked at Waukegan, we looked at North Chicago, Highland Park, and Highwood, the Round Lake area, as well as Waconda. So those were, so we tried to also look at different contexts of suburban lives. So from like more of a city context of Waukegan to like suburbs and exurbs, and then also sort of rural areas, and see how different contexts deal with integrating immigrants.
Of those communities, were there any that worked particularly well and any that really weren't functioning well at all?
Not necessarily. I think some did some things better, and
You can name names.
yeah. So Highland Park did very well, but they also have a very small immigrant population, and they also have a ton of money. Wealth speaks, affluence, means that they can hire the best teachers, they can attract people who have very high skills to help them integrate. So in that sense, they did well, but they were also dealing with a small fraction. I think that one of the main findings that we have, because we look at, is it race? Is it like how many immigrants moved into the area? Is it social class? What is it? Is it the density of social institutions that are in these communities? And what we found is that none of that was really relevant. But social institutions were relevant, not in terms of how many, because if it was based on density, Waukegan would be doing really well, and we know that Waukegan is not doing very well, is not a very welcoming place for immigrants. What we found was that there were communities, one particular community, the Round Lake area, in which there was one organization. And that organization made the whole difference. And the difference was, it was not in the density, but rather in how these organizations worked and were able to make alliances and inroads with the power structure that existed. Just like breaking into the old boys club, right? It's sort of like, how, what networks they had and what connections they had that they could translate into influencing policy.
So in towns or cities that had a stronger old boys club, it was harder?
I cannot say, it's not only that. I mean, there's a lot of factors, and, places like Waukegan also are dealing, very large, it's a very large context, so it's a lot more difficult than communities that are smaller. But I think that, one of the things that was relevant, it was that, social institutions we think are very important. We found everywhere we went that the Catholic Church was like crucial in integrating and providing services and in helping immigrants. But we found that, overall, in terms of what direction communities took in terms of integrating immigrants and policies at the local level, a lot of it, we saw that, and these are preliminary findings too, that it was that connection that these community organizations were able to build with the power structure, with city council, that really mattered in how that translated into more willingness to provide services that were specific for the immigrant community.
So, Grace and Mike, you have both worked in organizations that work with immigrants. So talk to us about the difficulties that you've encountered, and what are the primary difficulties to making an organization that is functional?
I think it's an interesting.
So what are the challenges in making an organization work? So, I have a lot of different hats. So I'm a grant maker, I'm a recovering state bureaucrat, and I've also worked in the community and in coalition with a lot of other immigrant refugee communities. So the experience that I immediately draw from is when I was the director of Chinese Mutual Aid Association, and we're located in the Uptown community, in the Argyle community, and the organization was formed through kind of, I would say, the bottom level, not in terms of importance, but in terms of the way that the hierarchy that Nick introduced, which is very self-help, mutual assistance, maybe higher educated or refugees who had greater means were helping other refugees learn English, learn how to navigate the system. But I think one key important piece of that was that there was actually funding. So if you think about our immigration system in the United States, it's very bifurcated when you think about funding. So refugees actually who come to the United States go through a very extensive process, but with that actually comes funding for resettlement. We can talk a long time about how that's inadequate for to resettle an individual and a family into a brand new setting. But if you look at the immigrant experience who are not refugees, there are actually no dollars that help with any sort of welcoming or integration into society. So the community in Uptown, kind of as it moved away, as it became more, as time passed, the funding from the federal government decreased, and the refugee organizations had to then begin to diversify its funding. And I think that that was a significant challenge, moving away from regular funding that came from the feds to looking at foundations, state grants, and other discretionary grants was a huge challenge. And I think the way that we were able to actually succeed at Chinese Mutual Aid was because we became organizers and advocates, that we were raising the issues that were important to our communities and actually challenging the system and shaking it to say, the system as it exists now is not working for a whole swath of people in the state. And so we were able to fight for funding on the statewide level. Some of it translated to the federal level, and this all happened in the mid-1990s when welfare reform, as we know it, was changed and negatively impacted immigrants and refugees as well. And instead of just turning inward and saying, okay, how can we help each other, it was also turning outward, where we formed this coalition across the city, across different immigrant and refugee populations, to stand up to, Congress, to say, this disproportionality impacts on legal permanent residents and other residents of this country is unacceptable. And so, I really feel like the work that was done in the mid-1990s really kind of laid the foundation for the remarkable work that I think currently happens on immigrant refugee issues here in Illinois. And so, as I was reflecting back on history and my work in this area over the past decade and a half, is if you think about the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant Refugee Rights, the name used to be the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Protection. So we've moved from this, we're going to protect, we're going to help, to we want to demand the rights that are due to this huge population that is increasingly, I think, politically powerful and politically germane.
Do you think that there are or were specific challenges to working with Chinese immigrants that might be different from, say, working with Mexican immigrants? I mean, I think a lot of us out there in the wide world at large conflate the word immigrants with Mexicans. A lot of white people do. And yet there are all these other immigrant groups, and I assume there are some distinctions in terms of, I don't know what.
Well, so I've never worked deeply within a Latino community. I've had a lot of alliances with other organizations, but I think that your point is really well taken. And even as I look, so I actually worked in Chinatown, and I also worked in Uptown in the Chinese community there, both in different community-based organizations. And I actually think that there is a lot of there are a lot of comparisons that can be drawn that are similar as it relates to the type of social service agencies that exist. But as I think about the kind of organizing and the grassroots leadership that currently reside in those communities, I would say because Uptown is so diverse and because there are alliances that have been built between the different immigrant and refugee populations, that the community on the north side is stronger as it relates to grassroots leadership and bottoms-up kind of organizing type systems change approaches. We fund actually an organization in Chinatown, and as we talked to them about their challenges in organizing, it was described to me that the system in Chinatown is a sort of a benevolent dictatorship. And so it's the changes that come or the decisions that are made by individuals with power at the top who are, again, trying to help the community but aren't necessarily including the communities in that decision. So I think that there are nuances all over the place, however you slice neighborhoods, ethnicities, nationalities.
Mike?
Well, I think that's a great segue. It's really hard for me to start with challenges, and I promise you, Mary, I'll get there.
Take your time.
But my assumption why I was invited here was my engagement in a specific community, a specific immigrant community of Yita, Little Village on Chicago's Southwest Side, and through my organization in Lhasa. Our organization, I think, really is leading the field in this mix of community organizing and service provision that's data influenced and outcome oriented in the fields of education, violence prevention, community economic development, and a swath of organizing throughout. But I think the reason that we're able to do the things that we are able to do is our philosophy, which is really what Grace is talking about, really leadership that's from within and grassroots oriented. Not that we push outside thinking away, we would be silly to do so. But our board of directors, for instance, is filled with individuals who have lived in our community for at least 10 years.
And that's a requirement?
It's a requirement. You have to have lived in the neighborhood for at least 10 years to be on our board of directors to guide the organization, right?
Do you have to be Latino?
No, as a matter of fact, we don't have all Latinos on the board. And as a matter of fact, you don't have to be Mexican either. I'm half Puerto Rican, by the way.
We can tell.
You can? I have a joke in Spanish and I'm not going to do it. Also, there's a lot of community strength in our neighborhood, and many of you know Little Village, and many of you have heard about the second Magnificent Mile, 26th Street, which has 500 business licenses within a 2-3 mile radius. My family grew up a basement and 3 floors at 2356 South Lawndale, all family, right? Cousins, distant cousins, etc. And I'm the last person left in the neighborhood at 3047 South Lawndale. And everybody else lives in Garfield Ridge, between Cicero and Harlem on Archer now, right? But that house at 2356 South Lawndale is now full of new residents and recent immigrants, right? That house still is full and is at 26th Street still receiving that benefit from that influx of immigration, right? Which really is a strength of our community. We obviously do have our challenges, and I think many of those challenges come from structural issues. First and foremost, you said it very well around our immigration system. The fact is that my sister came here to live, maybe 10, 15 years ago, brought my 3-year-old niece at the time, who's now potentially going to be the valedictorian of her high school, but since she's undocumented, has so many barriers in front of her, right?
And where did she come from?
Monterrey, Nuevo León, Mexico, right? What's out there in front of her is a number of barriers. Even given the fact that she has deferred action to rely on. The fact is that every 2 years, those young people have to reapply and still be worried about whether that law will be, or not even a law. I mean, it's an administrative action, right? Whether that administrative action will be voted down by Congress, which it's been tried, what's been tried for several years. Structurally, we had issues with building wealth. The Latino community, and particularly the immigrant community during the recession, was one of the communities hit hardest by that recession. I bought my house for, full transparency, at $167,000 in 2003. 2 years ago, it was probably worth $90,000, right? The wealth in our community, which is largely tied in the homes that we own, was just devastated in the recession, right? That lack of wealth accumulation, that lack of social capital that goes along with that, also leads to the fact that since 2007, Little Village has had 119 people murdered in our community, right? We have the #1 percentage of any community in the city of Chicago for youth murders, right? Of our murders, over 60% are individuals younger than the age of 25. So, these structural challenges that we're dealing with in immigrant communities are very difficult to overcome, but at the same time, that persevering entrepreneurial spirit in the immigrant community leads to the fact that 26th Street, relative to other business districts throughout the city, did better during the recession as far as store closing, as far as keeping with their tax revenue, as cited through Tesla Associates and their work in Little Village. So, I gauge the challenges with really a persevering entrepreneurial spirit that really is very consistent with the immigrant experience here in this country. It's a persevering experience that overcomes.
Can you give us an example of something you've done in your organization that has made a difference?
Certainly. I'm glad Simone just walked in the door. She reminds me of so many things that we do so great in our community. Again, someone from outside the neighborhood who came to live in the neighborhood, an amazing leader in our neighborhood, who leads our participatory budgeting process. So a process that started in Brazil, it's now in a number of cities throughout the country. It's in a couple wards here in the city, and the big issue with participatory budgeting was that Black and brown folks and poor folks were not being involved with it here in the city. Well, we brought it to the 22nd Ward, which is largely Little Village, and small parts of North Lawndale, Clare, Benham Park. And what we said was, we held the aldermen accountable, and we said, we want $1 million of your annual budget to go towards whatever the community votes towards. So we had 600, 700 individuals vote as young as the age of 14. All you had to do was prove that you live in the neighborhood, don't have to prove your status, and you got to vote on what that money went towards. It's a very empowering process. That's a real community organizing victory in our community. In the previous panel, there was a question that was posed, I think, by Craig, towards community benefits agreements, right? We're working currently on a community benefits agreement for some proposed developments in our neighborhood, and those sitting at the table are primarily, many of which are Spanish speakers, some young people who are negotiating terms for a neighborhood developer to come into the neighborhood, right? I mean, I think those are some of the things that we've done. Immigrant services through our partnership with ICER. I think the laws that we've been able to impact in the state of Illinois, particularly because of our organizing in conjunction with ICER, have been tremendous. The changes we've made locally have been wonderful. We're one of the only states in the country where undocumented immigrants can receive a driver's license. Now, while it's temporary and while there's some issues with getting it, I think that was a huge win for us, right? There's been a number of those wins through these neighborhood collaboratives that funnel up to this organizing group, ICER, and other groups like the Latino Policy Forum and the Latino Agenda that are fighting for the rights of our communities.
I want to go back a bit to the impasse with immigration reform and talk about how you feel this is affecting not just the life of immigrants, but the work that social organizations can do, need to do, can't do. Nick, maybe in your paper you had a summary of where we are with immigration law. And a lot of people you probably know, but just tell us how many times immigration reform has failed in the past.
This situation is a mess, but I'll tell you, the thing that's ringing in my ears is this 119 murders in Little Village. And so if I could duck one question and answer a different one is this. Where the immigration system and the impasse that we have intersects with the criminal justice system and results in 119 murders. I don't know how many of these are unsolved. So last year we released a study where we surveyed 2,000 Latinos, a random sample of 2,000 Latinos in 4 counties. Harris County, which is Houston, Cook County, Chicago, Maricopa County in Arizona, and Los Angeles County. And we wanted to know the impact of the Bush administration's policy that has local police involved in immigration enforcement and the deepening of that policy under the Obama administration. What impact has it had on Latinos' willingness to cooperate with police? Because as we all know, police alone do not solve crimes. There has to be collaboration and cooperation between police and communities if crime are to be solved, if public safety is to be improved. So what we found is that this intersection between these two systems, immigration and criminal justice, has produced perverse, unintended consequences. And I'll just give you 2 numbers. When asked, this random sample of Latino residents in those 4 counties, when they were asked, how likely are you to voluntarily come forward to police if you've been the victim of the crime? What we found was that 44% said that they would be less likely to voluntarily approach the police if they've been the victim of a crime for the sole reason that because they feared that police would ask them or people they knew about their immigration status. 45% of respondents said that they would not come forward to the police if they had information about a crime for the very same reason, because they feared police would ask them or people they knew about their immigration status. So this immigration impasse not only has had devastating consequences for individual families, on communities, but for issues that we all are impacted by, things like public safety.
Are there places, so just review for us what that Bush administration law edict was that led to this?
Right, so under Bush and then Obama, we had the 287G agreements, which were memoranda of agreement between local law enforcement authorities and ICE, and immigration enforcement authorities. Under the Obama administration, we have the Secure Communities Program. And so what they're trying to do is deepen the collaboration in the enforcement of immigration policies. Some police departments have supported this, some localities have supported it, many others have not. And within the law enforcement community, I'll tell you, there's been a vigorous debate about the merits of these policies and the chilling effect they've had on Latino's cooperation with police.
Are there cities that have actively repudiated that?
Excuse me?
Are there cities that have actively
Well, here
repudiated
in Illinois there have been, and in a number of other places around the country, yet some sheriffs who are elected officials are running on that very campaign. This, like so much else in the immigration policy debate, has completely polarized the field. And it's just one of those issues that we fail to get our hands around, yet have implications every day for the way in which life is lived in our cities.
Can I add some color to that? I'm glad Manny's here, is Chief of Staff to Jesus Garcia, Commissioner Garcia, who several years ago led an effort legislatively that was also supported through a number of community groups to separate ICE, the Immigration Customs Enforcement Agency, federal ICE, with their work that they were doing in Cook County jails. They were essentially holding people if they either posted bond or were free to go on their own volition because they were not found to be guilty of anything. They were holding those individuals for up to 72 hours after they had posted bond or been found not guilty if ICE put a detainer ordinance on them. So if they suspected that these individuals were undocumented. I mean, unconstitutional, unjust, double jeopardy. I got a couple other words for you, but I'm not going to say them here. Commissioner Garcia led an effort, and the county board enacted a law that basically said that ICE had to either pay for that stay or those detainers were not going to be honored. ICE wasn't going to pay for them, so we knew that we won that one. So that was a win locally. But also we're working on, hopefully in this legislative session, and I ask folks around the room to think about this and think about what potentially you can do to help move this legislation forward. But the Trust Act would separate local law enforcement agencies would separate them forcibly from working with immigration services, would not allow local authorities to basically call ICE if they suspected someone for being undocumented. And while I'll be honest with you, there are some undesirable individuals who are undocumented in this country who I wouldn't mind leaving the country. That's a very, very small number. And the way these instruments have been utilized in our country has been detrimental to every person who lives in this country. It really has. 1,100 people being deported daily, right? I was on President Barack Obama's Urban Policy Committee when he first ran in 2008. And you know what? As a member of the National Council of La Raza, I stood there as president of that organization, called the president, the deporter-in-chief. He's really earned that title, and we need to hold him accountable now for moving forward legislation, or administrative action, which he has now delayed until after the elections. He sends a signal to our communities that electing a couple of Democratic U.S. senators is more important than assisting our communities in resolving for these issues that you're talking about so eloquently. So there are some things on the horizon. I hope to see many of you in Springfield advocating for the Trust Act, or not lobbying, right, Grace? It's advocating for the Trust Act, educating, yes, for the Trust Act passage. Hopefully in the veto session, if not in the spring session.
But that brings us back to the work of, community organizations or organizations. So, if that's going to happen, somebody's got to organize the people to go down to Springfield to do the work that needs to be done. Is that getting done?
Yes, and not enough. So the Woods Fund hat on. So we are probably one of the few foundations in Chicago who fund community organizing and public policy just straight out. And we have been doing that for 20 years. And a lot of it is because we believe fiercely that those who are most impacted need to be part of the solutions that are being created, and that the systems that currently exist are not built for everyone, right? And so I think another part of the reason, though, is that we're a really bunch of practical people. So our endowment is about $60 million. It's relatively small, probably in the landscape of foundations here in Illinois. But we can make a decision as to whether we want to fund direct services and contribute to, as Nick said, filling in the gaps that government systems are leaving wide open. Or we can actually try to impact and change the systems that are leaving huge gaps and leaving a whole bunch of folks out. And so, all the work that we fund, organizations like Enlace, is to shake up the system and do it by engaging those folks who are most impacted in that. So as I think about the question about help or hinder, do social institutions, it's both. If the social institution is only providing, basic needs assistance, they can only do that as long as they're getting a check from a foundation or from a government entity or from, individual donors. And the power then again is taken away from that community. But if the power is in addition to that, we're organizing and building kind of the power and the voice of residents, there's longevity in that, in changing the way that the system is operating. And so I worked in government for a very long time, and government is built to not change, and very inherently to not change. Because it has to be solid technically, it has to be reliable technically, and so there's lots of rules and bureaucracy to make sure that it stays the way it is. If you want to make a change, there has to be a lot of disruption, it has to be a lot of agitation, and that can only happen when people are organized, not only organized within their own communities, but organized across communities and working in solidarity with other communities. So, kind of linking back to the question that you just asked around the impasse around immigration reform, the impasse is, as I talk to organizers, and I have the great benefit of being able to listen to a lot of the work that is happening across the city. And people are getting tired of working on immigration reform. You know, these are leaders who work one or two or three jobs. They have children, but they're active. They're in Springfield. They're calling their legislators. They're going door to door. There's a weariness there. But what I also
to the point of giving up.
no. So what I also see though is greater solidarity in working on other issues that where there is common experience. And so so there's a huge convergence, I think, of immigrant and refugee rights, of economic justice, and workers' rights. So you see there's the Fight for 15 campaign, the minimum wage increase. I think that you're seeing a lot of organizations who have not ordinarily worked together on these types of issues coming together and building not only unity, but also building power. And that is translating also into a huge effort to register 100,000 voters in Cook County during this whole entire summer. And that's a cross-section of labor, community-based organizations, faith-based organizations, coalitions. I think Enlace is part of that as well.
But, you know, this brings us back to NILDA in a way. And, you know, you're talking about bringing organizations together, bringing communities together. And we were talking earlier, NILDA talked to us a little bit about just the gap between the suburbs and Chicago and the difficulty of bridging that and what that costs immigrants and the rest of us.
Yeah, one of the things that was very clear when we're talking to people is that although most of these communities we went to are within a 50-mile radius of Chicago, they might as well be in the middle of Idaho. You know, there was really no communication with Chicago. There are some infrastructural problems, such as, you know, lack of transportation from the suburbs to the city. The other thing that's happened is that because immigrants are bypassing Chicago, they don't have those connections in the city. So immigrants are going directly, and what you have is networks of people who are from the same area in Mexico, for instance, right? And so they don't have those connections with Chicago.
Why are they bypassing Chicago?
I'm sorry?
Why are they bypassing Chicago?
Because of jobs, they're going to where the jobs are, and so most of the jobs are now in suburban areas, and so they're working in landscaping, in the, you know, agriculture, and other jobs like that, and so they bypass the city, so they don't have that connection. They are not equal kind of organizations like yours in the suburbs, right? And so you know, I think that social institutions have played a very crucial role, because it's a give and take, because you have, like, they build capacity among immigrants. Immigrants bring their strength. Many people bring incredible ways of organizing, but, you know, what I think many of these organizations do is that they take them a step further, right? And by teaching English or by teaching particular skills, many times that can lead to you know. And we have one example. One of our students is working in a community, looking at how parents have become incredible crafty in how they deal with the school district. And
In that community?
so this was in the Round Lake area, one of the communities in the Round Lake area, in which parents have become, you know, very involved in the schools. They have learned their rights. They are very proactive, and a lot of that had to do, you know, the parents took the initiative. I mean, they ran with it. This organization gave them a little bit, it's called Mano a Mano, gave them a little bit, and I think these parents just ran with this, right? And so are affecting change in their communities. But, you know, I think also that one of the things that is limiting in suburbs, and going to what Nick was talking about immigration policy at the larger context, is that these translate the lack of comprehensive immigration reform. What it does is that these communities then make their own. And so what we see in many of these suburban communities is what is called, you know, in the literature people talk about, you know, immigration laws or immigration policy by proxy. These are things that, you know, laws and ordinances that come up that do not spell out immigrant or Mexican or Latino or African American, but actually those are the populations that they're targeting. And I'm talking about noise ordinances, in which if you have a birthday party for your child who had their first communion and you have music, the police may be called by your neighbors because of loudness. Right? We had also towing ordinances in which they are random checks. It's not that you did a traffic violation, but rather stopping you and demanding to see your driver's license, and if there's anything out of order, they take your car. By the time you can get, they typically do this on Fridays so that the fees hike up during the weekend, because you cannot get your car in the weekend, and every day it's stored, the fees go up. And so by the time people can go and get their car, sometimes it's over $600, usually closer to $1,000. Right, and so housing, Waukegan passed an ordinance in which if you're going to sell a house, you have to have the city come and certify how many people can live in that house, and that has to be in the papers when you're selling the house, so that the next owner, if they violate, like if it says only 6 people can live in this house, if they violate that, so it's those kinds of things. So I think that when you have this lack of broader, larger, comprehensive immigration reform, you get that many localities then make their own.
Yeah. I think on the organizing side, in the midst of this turmoil and the perversity of so much of the immigration rules, has been this upsurge in immigrant organizing, especially around labor market issues. And so you look at, and often across communities. So in the case of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, in the survey we did with them in 14 US cities, we interviewed workers from 71 different countries. In our research meetings, some of those meetings were conducted in 4 or 5 languages. And so what you see within some of these organizations are an attempt to bridge these divides, to bridge some of the segregation, and to present a united front. In the case of the day laborers, same sort of situation, where they have melded popular education philosophies and liberation theology philosophies that they had within Latin America with experiences in the United States, such as a lot of experiences from the African American civil rights movement in this country. And so we're seeing different kinds of things happening within this upsurge, barriers being breached, communities coming together, and new strategies being formed. It's been a dark time in many ways because the immigration policy casts such a long shadow over our communities, and at the same time it's an incredibly vibrant period that probably is transforming the way in which organizing is occurring in this country for decades to come.
There's a young lady in our organization. She lives 2 blocks away from our office, who's actually leading our voter registrations efforts this summer. She keeps on kidding me because she's like, Mike, you made me get this tan. She's like the most tan I've ever seen. And she's been out there registering voters, and she's been out there day after day. Right? And, she has an interesting history because she was born in Mexico, but her father's actually German. Met her mother in Mexico, and then they came here. And she's undocumented, right? She's received DACA, but, just 7 or 8 months ago, she was one of 40 people who were calling on the president to stop the deportations. And with those 40 other individuals, they shut down Clark Street off of Congress and sat in the middle of the street and said, we're not moving until we get some action on this. She's very emblematic of the spirit, the energy, the commitment of our young people in this country. And really, they're the ones that made DACA happen, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. It was these young people who said, we want action now, and we're going to do something about it. And they came out, and they started testifying in front of the Capitol building, and both in D.C. and here locally, saying, I'm undocumented. I came to this country at a young age. I'm getting damn good grades in school, and I have no future. Do something about it.
So do you see in a widespread way, and if you can answer this, a generation gap in terms of engagement in organizations, engagement in social action on behalf of immigrants?
I think the young people have taken it to the next level, right? But at the same time, our immigration action team at ANASA is full of folks who are both young and older, right? I can think of a woman by the name of Siria Ruiz, who volunteers every day at the grammar school a block away from our office as a crossing guard. And then on Fridays, when we have our action team meeting, she walks over to our office and is one of the most vocal individuals, and always demands that I have food at the meetings. So I remember her quite frequently. But the fact is that I don't necessarily see a gap. I see folks working together, but certainly our young people have really, really taken it to the next level, and I have to laud them for really taking leadership on their issue.
Yeah, I don't think it's a gap. I think also that the young people have a very different experience. They grow up in this country, they grow up as Americans, right? In that sense, they grow up in the schools here, and so they have a different take on how to demand rights, right?
A more assertive take?
I'm sorry?
A more assertive?
They're not more assertive. It's like they belong in this country. They're from here. They have grown up here, or the socialization has been here, and so this is home for them. And so they have a different outlook, I think, on demanding what they think is right. What is right, actually, what is right. And so I think that in that they sort of deviate from the older immigrant population.
One of the things that I think about when I think about the Dreamers movement, right, is that there's an organization called IJL, Immigrant Justice Youth Justice League. There's a youth somewhere. So, they're actually pushing the boundaries of what we normally see as organizations that we want to fund, because normally when you fund a nonprofit organization, there's an executive director, there's a board of directors, you have financial controls, you have an audit, blah, 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 yada, yada. Well, they're not interested in necessarily being organized in that type of structure, and so they kind of push back and say, well, we don't have an executive director, and we don't really actually think we need a space, an office space. And so they continue to be their fiscal sponsors in Illinois Coalition for Immigrant Refugee Rights. And so even as we begin to think about organizations and this construct that we've created of nonprofit organizations going to a nonprofit foundation for money, and we have to fill out these forms, and we have to be organized in this way, and we need to have a board, I think that there is a little bit of pushback there. Do organizations who do this work have to fit within that kind of square? And that's something that we've been thinking about as well at the Woods Fund. And as we think about emerging organizations or new organizations, a good organization who's doing organizing doesn't necessarily have to be around for another 15 years, right, or 10 years. So our vision as to what a good quality nonprofit organization,
Kind of like pop-up non.
right. And so we, as we think about capacity building, are we trying to build capacity in the frame that we think a good organization is? And so that's one of the things that I think about as it relates to funding this work, is that we have to think outside the box as well as funders, and not just try to create a cookie cutter to have different organizations fall within.
We have a few questions from the audience. Thank you. Recently, Heartland Healthcare, a nonprofit, made local headlines for announcing it was to open its first 2 centers outside Chicago to serve the growing suburban poverty. Is this a trend for serving the poor and for immigrants?
Well, we did a survey a few years ago of immigrant serving organizations in Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York, partnered with UCLA and CUNY in New York. And one of the questions we were interested in, which was the issue that Nilda was highlighting: what is the reach of the social service system, the nonprofit organizations, to these new gateway communities? And what we found probably isn't surprising to any of you, that there are vast portions of our metropolitan area that have seen a big growth in migration from different parts of the world, and the social service infrastructure is not there currently to serve those populations. They don't have the cultural competencies often. they don't have the language skills, they don't have the reach in the community. So I think it's incumbent on the sector as a whole to address the changing demographic patterns in the county, in the metropolitan area, and to try to ensure that this social infrastructure, as I've been calling it, exists so that we don't have large pockets of unmet needs. So I'm not familiar with this particular case of Heartland Healthcare doing that, but I imagine this is something we'll be seeing in the future.
I think that it is difficult for, because, from the point of the suburbs, seeing organizations from Chicago come in as invading, and they don't have the connections of, and the relationship with City Hall, for instance. And so this becomes, so the reach, so it is important to make this reach, but I think also it is important to build within those communities, within the suburbs, a base that then they can effect change. So I think that,
Just really quickly, I'm a part of LAS is part of a collaboration called the United Congress of Community and Religious Organizations. And we just brought on our first suburban member, which is PASO, the West Suburban Action Project. I know in Spanish. Is that right?
Yeah.
At any rate, again, local leadership forming an organization to fight for the rights of immigrants in Melrose Park, right? Just recently, the town of Melrose Park approved a strip club across the street or next door to a religious institution. Actually, where nuns reside, forgive me. Convent, yes. I mean, and the forgive my, Spanish and English is just stuff to me both. How brazen, right? The city just goes right ahead against the wishes of these nuns and builds a strip club, right? I mean, PASO was at the forefront of organizing community members to fight back against that, right? So I think there's an emerging institutional power basis coming out in the suburbs, and I'm really interested to see where it goes. My focus isn't in the suburbs, so I'm watching from afar. I don't want to be that invading organization. Our focus is in the village.
How can neighborhoods and cities build a responsive social service net with undocumented immigrants, most particularly in terms of affordable housing protections?
I have no idea.
What a good question.
Thanks.
On the issue of competency, how do we develop institutions that work successfully with immigrants in the city to become competent in working in a suburban context? Not sure what worked in the city automatically transfers to suburbs, especially the further you move away from the city.
I mean, again, I think that it is not that organizations from Chicago shouldn't go, they should go, but there is a need. I mean, what we found is that there were organizations that were going, but they were not very effective in the long term. I think that it's like grow your own. You need to go into these communities and lend a hand, train people, give them the language skills. This is easily done with parents, like in schools, because you can teach them what are the, you can help them learn what are the rights of parents, what are the rights of children in school, things that are foreign to them just because they're in a different context, in a different country, right, that has a different set of rules. And so I think strongly of lending a hand, but also focusing not on going there and being the savior, but rather going there to help build an infrastructure within the immigrant community so that then the immigrant community can then penetrate into these power structures in these places and really affect change and change policy.
Can I just add one thing? I mean, there are capacity questions across the nonprofit sector as a whole. I'll give you an example from a different community. So the North Lawndale Employment Network, based in North Lawndale, found themselves serving a county-wide, at least, population for formerly incarcerated individuals. The lack of institutional infrastructure in the south suburbs in particular led people that come from Harvey and other communities to North Lawndale. I mean, ordinarily, you wouldn't think of that type of flow. North Lawndale is certainly not a community that has tons of resources flowing into it. But in the vast wasteland that is the nonprofit sector for formerly incarcerated individuals, they were a beacon. Instituto del Progreso Latino in Pilsen has become a region-wide organization that, yes, serves Pilsen Little Village, but also has residents from the region as a whole coming in. To me, these are indications both of organizational strength of those two organizations, but more so a symptom of an unevenly developed sector where there are areas of needs throughout the region that simply are not being met. And so you have people traveling great distances well outside their community to try to get services.
So whose responsibility, whose job is it to even that out? I mean, who's going to go do that work?
Well, a lot of this is a funding question. So, naturally we'll look at the public sector for some of the funding of those resources, and we also look at the philanthropic sector as a partner in this. But I think that there's pent-up demand in many of these communities. I'm not surprised to hear in Melrose Park an organization has emerged. But for the funding, I think you'd see a bunch of other flowers blooming in the region, but the funding simply hasn't been there in these times of austerity that we're living through.
I would actually take a little step back before we say that the funding is going to resolve those capacity issues. I think people need to be agitated to the level that they're advocating on their own self-interest and creating organizations that then will attract this funding, right? So,
How do you agitate them?
So in the case of, wonderful question. I just had a one-on-one with the executive director of PASO, and she told me she got started because she was a college student in the early 2000s and was faced with the fact that since she was undocumented, she didn't have any avenues for scholarships or financial aid. She started working at this Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights, went to organizing trainings, and got agitated to do something about it. Started her own organization at her local parish, Mount Carmel, I believe, in Melrose Park, and there goes PASO. She starts her own organization, made up of residents of that community on the board. Now they're a growing organization working on behalf of that community. I think leadership needs to be developed. We need to be a little bit more intentional, I think, about targeting those people and figuring out how to target them so we can agitate them appropriately. And I think that's a little bit of what your question is coming towards.
Appropriate agitation. Right. Useful agitation. Useful agitation, right.
But I think that there is a role that we don't talk about sufficiently about what the public sector's responsibility is. And I fear that as you have social entrepreneurs, impact investors, you have more of the private sector entering into the space where the public sector used to be, that there again provides very unequal distribution. And again, the power of where resources are and what organizations get funded are at the hands of very few people who actually who have the wealth, who control the dollars. And so, you've seen a very slow and fast erosion of just basic human services in Illinois. And we are in jeopardy as a state. There's a fixation on pensions, rightly so, but the way that we have been actually providing care, basic services for people in Illinois, has just gotten to the point where the burden is shifting to nonprofit organizations, and really it's become a kind of, what is that analogy of, you're trying to claw yourself out of this hole. And if you have a benevolent, generous donor, you can thrive. But if you're in a community that doesn't have that, or doesn't have the political welcoming spirit, then you fail. And I'm not sure that that's what we want for our society. So I think that we need to relook and say, what do we want from our public systems, and are we willing to pay for it?
That would be a great concluding statement. But since we have about 2 minutes left, I'd like to give each of you the chance to just, say, what is an idea or two that you hope that people here would leave with?
I think that that we need to think more regionally. I think that many times we're thinking very micro to our, and I think that by making links with other communities, you only gain strength and you can help develop these kind of competencies that people in the community need so that they can take care of their business, right? And they can really affect change in their communities, and it's a matter of helping people develop leadership and take it to a next level so that they can successfully change their communities and their lives.
Yeah, I mean, the drum that we beat all the time as a foundation who funds organizing is that we need more foundations to fund organizing. You know, who are we as individuals who are very privileged to be in a place where we can actually provide resources to nonprofit organizations to dictate what those things are. And so by saying you fund organizing, you're actually giving the power of back to the community to say these are the things that we work on. So that's what we continue to try to communicate.
You know, the return of the neighborhood as an urban strategy. I think that Linda's right on the aspect of folks learning from each other best practices and sharing those best practices. You know, us locally, we have an effort around our violence prevention where we're working with 12 different organizations in our community, and we're all sharing the same database, targeting strategy, a pre and post test, really data influence and outcome oriented. And many of the groups that we're working with really didn't have a system before this, right? Really had no way of figuring out how well they're doing, right? Here's an example of those organizations now have learned from this process, and while they saw it as problematic for their operations at the beginning, are now seeing it as a benefit to their fundraising and as their ability to grow. So I think there's you know, the investment locally in Little Village towards this effort. It was an urban strategy, right, that worked, that we hope that would be replicated in other spaces, right? So I really appreciate that frame of view of taking best practices from a neighborhood level and duplicating them elsewhere. But I would caution that a neighborhood as a strategy should be a focal point for regional planning, for local planning, for investments at all levels of power, if you will.
So the question of immigration reform and this question of mass incarceration are two of the most pressing issues of our time. I would argue that the public sector, that our elected officials haven't done their job in ensuring that those systems operate efficiently or fairly. And as a result, the symptoms, the fallout from those systems are landing on these very communities and on these community organizations to try to pick up the pieces so that people can go on with their lives. There's something wrong with that kind of arrangement, and I think what we have to ask ourselves is what kind of policy do we need? What ways can we support these organizations, and how can we ensure that these two systems in particular, and they're not alone in just these, but these two systems in particular, quit producing the perverse effects that they are in our city and in our country.
Always good to leave on a question. Thank you all, and thank you all for coming.